It's been 20 years since Nigeria turned its back on military rule and embraced democracy. 2 decades on, and there's a regular pattern of violent attacks. The economy is stagnant, and you're lucky if you've got a job. So what, if any, has been the democratic dividend for Nigerians? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine. Now, it's 20 years since military leaders in Nigeria stepped aside. They allowed for a presidential election and that led to civilian rule. The last few years, though, have been particularly challenging for Africa's most populous country of around 200 million. 45% of people live in extreme poverty. Economic growth has slowed and government forces are battling armed groups like Boko Haram. Sarah Kairat reports.
An image of modern Nigeria, gleaming skyscrapers and young people on the move. But a lot has changed since 1999, when Nigerians were allowed to vote for a civilian president after 3 decades of coups and military rule.
Do solemnly swear.
President Muhammadu Buhari was re-elected for a 4-year term in February. He won just over half of the ballot. Voter turnout was at a record low at 35%. A study last year found that only a third of Nigerians are happy with their democracy, and nearly 3/4 believe politicians are corrupt. Under Buhari's leadership, Nigeria's economic growth has slowed significantly to just 2%. Millions of young people don't have a job. In fact, the official youth unemployment rate is 36%. And it's estimated that nearly 87 million Nigerians live in extreme poverty, the highest in the world. Widespread electricity shortages are common too. And then there's the ongoing battle against armed groups such as Boko Haram that continue to carry out attacks in the north. After 20 years of democracy, many Nigerians believe they deserve a better future. Sarah Kairat, Inside Story.
All right, let's introduce our panel now. In Edinburgh, that's in Scotland, we have Olly Owen, who's lecturer at Oxford University's Africa Studies Centre. In London, we have Adama Gaye, former information director at the Economic Community of West African States, better known as ECOWAS, really. Welcome to you both. Thank you very much indeed. Adama, let me start with you, because you've been on the continent for so long. You were there at the time. What was the democratic dividend supposed to be for Nigeria? How was Nigeria supposed to gain from embracing democracy?
If you recall that time, it was when Nigeria was, at a certain point, a pariah nation. That was the time of the Abacha regime. And when overnight, in 1998, Abacha passed away, and at the same time, the so-called winner of the democratic election of June 12, 1993, Mr. Abiola, Moshood Abiola, also passed away. It was said in the Nigerian press that this was a divine intervention that would give Nigeria a chance to start afresh. That was the time when, overnight, Mr. General Abdul Salami Abubakar became the president of Nigeria and decided to start afresh, opening up Nigeria's democratic process. And this was organized by the military to get out of the process, to end what used to be called the militics, the role of military in politics in Nigeria. And that's when the electoral process was allowed to go through. And on May 29, 1999, I recall that vividly. It was a new day with the election of Olusegun Obasanjo, who was pulled out of prison and allowed to run, and he won the election. The Nigerians expected democratic process to usher in a new era of liberty, of freedom, of economic prosperity, of Nigeria returning to its position as the leading, the essential nation in the African continent.
Right.
That was then.
Right.
Now,
okay.
I think
let's come to Adama, let's come to now in just a moment. Let me go to Olly. Olly, was it maybe rather overly optimistic of the Nigerian people to expect that embracing democracy would allow for liberties, for freedom, for even prosperity?
Well, I think, as Adama has rightly pointed out, the date tomorrow, June 12th, is hugely significant because that was the date originally Nigeria was supposed to return to democracy in 1993, and which the military annulled, and that's what we're actually commemorating tomorrow on that day. And what led to democracy in the end was the public protesting against that annulment. It was people fighting for this industry. It was people pushing for civil liberties to keep the democratic space open. People got killed in that struggle, just as they did in the apartheid struggle. People like Dele Giwa, people like Kudira Abiola, who was the wife of the candidate who won. Journalists were killed, student protesters were killed. So civil society really pushed for that transition, and the military reluctantly accepted it. But what happened after the transition really was that the people who really pushed for it didn't necessarily rush in and occupy the space, and instead, people who were kind of closely related to the former elites, to the old way of doing things, quickly rushed back in and democratized themselves. So actually, the 20 years since Nigeria returned to democracy has been about people trying to fill in that democracy with popular participation and still reclaiming it. It's a work in progress.
Right, Adama, so 20 years, quite clearly, in the case of Nigeria, is not a very long time in order to establish firm and solid democratic structures and institutions.
Absolutely. I think that it was a far-fetched dream of Nigerians to expect that overnight the embrace of democracy would allow their country to get away from its difficulties and start a new day. This didn't happen because the institutions were not solid, and like Olly said, the people who took over were the same kind of culprit that had been prospering under the military rules. So it was said, and it is still argued, that you can't build a democracy without Democrats. The people who came to take over from the military, they had made a deal with the military, but when they took over, they were sure that they wanted to make money out of the new dispensation, and that's what we saw. The people who took over, they became filthily rich. And this situation is still, I think, playing against the role of Nigeria as a leading democracy. Also, the civil society and the actors that made democracy really to be something accepted by the Nigerian military and the world at large, they didn't play their role in accompanying the democratic process. For instance, the Nigerian press, I recall, I was there then as not just a director of ECOWAS information, but also later on as the consultant for the Nigerian government military regime to accompany it towards civilian regime. And I actually coined the concept of Democracy Day for May 29, 1999. I recall that the media that played a key role, like the group Estelle, they were nowhere to be seen. They seemed suddenly willing, like this day and other media institutions and other political actors, they seem to be comfortable with the new dispensation of civilian, and they didn't really act as proper watchdog to ensure that democracy was really able to deliver the goods that were expected from it.
So, Olly, then, is it unrealistic to expect a true and established and a rigorous form of democracy to be able to establish itself in a country that doesn't have the institutions, doesn't have the practices, doesn't actually have the culture, the democratic culture that is necessary? Is it unrealistic to expect that democracy can take a hold in 20 years?
No, not at all. I think there's two things here. One is that there is a lot in Nigerian culture and Nigerian everyday culture that supports free speech, democracy, participation, people making decisions between themselves, and accountability. There's a lot there in that tradition, and it's a very long and healthy tradition in Nigeria, a tradition of civic politics and community politics. There's a long tradition of party politics. And much as people might be dissatisfied with the way that things are going, and it's a work in progress, there's no question that it's on a path to improvement. One of the landmarks, I think, was when President Obasanjo fell out with Vice President Atiku in the second term, they fought that battle through the courts, actually, and that consolidated
All right,
democracy
but
because
Olly,
it was using the constitutional institutions.
But Olly, you're saying it's much better. I mean, for the average Nigerian, I'm not so sure that that's the case. We've got the data. The data suggests that economic growth is much lower than it has been in the last 10 years. We know that unemployment is up, and just the provision of electricity, Olly, is spasmodic to say the least. About a half, 50% of Nigerians have access to electricity. So how is it improving for Nigerians?
So this is two separate questions. One is your question about elections, and as I was saying, that's been getting steadily improving. If you see the way that it was done at the under Maurice Iwu, INEC didn't even have voter numbers, didn't even have numbers on the ballot papers, so the election results were just made up. In 2015, you had an election result that really played through. Now, the second half of this question is about how that translates into policy. One is about making sure that you can get rid of a government you don't like. That's the basic condition of democracy. The other is about making policy that listens to people's concerns. And that's the second challenge. Democracy isn't just about elections. It's also about prioritizing what the public are trying to tell you about their pressing everyday concerns, whether that's economic management, services, or any other things. So, and if you want to look for the changes in those things, actually look at the subnational level. In states of Nigeria where some governments are really listening to people and really making a lot of difference on the ground in terms of services, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of development, and in other states, such as we recently saw in Kano, where they've decided to go down a role of political thuggery. So actually, there's a lot of difference within Nigeria. Talking about just one picture doesn't capture all of it.
Right, it's a vast country, of course. And Adama, I mean, the label defective democracy has been used for Nigeria, as well as some other countries that have gone through the process of trying to establish a democratic system, but clearly there are flaws. Is a flawed democracy better than none at all?
Look, you cannot complain about something you have been yearning for so long. African countries, for many years, were unhappy about monocracy across the continent, about autocracies, about leaders who didn't take care about the willingness of the people to see transformation, at least to have freedom of speech. But the type of democracy we have had across Africa, including in Nigeria, has not been true democracy. Democracy, as you always said, is not just about going to the polling booth and vote. It's about ensuring fairness in the distribution of the wealth. In Nigeria, for instance, you have one of the biggest inequity in terms of wealth distribution. Few people are filthily rich, while the vast majority are extremely poor. So as a result, what do you see? People do not go to vote. During the last presidential election of February 23rd, we have witnessed hardly 30 million people voting out of over 80 million registered voters in a country of 200 million people. Since 2003, the people's number of voting people is declining. So this is an indication that this type of democracy is not providing what was expected from it. Across Africa, it's the same thing. You see corruption rising.
Absolutely, Adama.
Whether in Senegal.
That's a view
Yes.
that I've personally have heard increasingly coming from African voices. And Olly, coming to you, I mean, Salif Keita, the well-known Malian musician, I mean, he's added his voice to the whole debate, saying that actually democracy doesn't work for African countries, and what Africa needs, each African country needs, is a benevolent dictator, was the phrase that he used. I mean, do you agree with him?
I think that's an extremely dangerous thing to put on the cards, because that's what militaries across the continent have used as their excuse and justification to step in. And once they step in and they assume those powers, the benevolence goes and the dictatorship stays. I think it's a really, really dangerous kind of impatience. I think much as it is an unattractive prospect, pushing every little bit to get better and better. Yes, I agree. In the Nigeria elections this year, turnout wasn't fantastic, partly because the public wasn't massively excited about two candidates who've been around for a long time and they've seen before. So it's more about getting fresh faces in. Those fresh faces don't have to be a choice between the military or politicians who've been around for a long time. It's also about other people coming up and showing what they've got to offer.
Indeed. And Adama, I mean, there is an alternative model, isn't there? There's something in between having military rule and having a fully fledged democracy, and that is the autocratic leader, as witnessed in somewhere like Rwanda, where Paul Kagame's government can boast exceptionally high results, excellent results in terms of all the barometers of development. But of course, when it comes to civil and individual freedoms, much less so.
Yes, that's the type of state that was developed, not just in Rwanda, but in the East Asian model, in countries like Singapore, in Taiwan, in Korea, and even under China today, under Xi Jinping, and even under Deng Xiaoping. That approach of a strong man at the helm may be appealing to countries where civilian democracies have turned to be really corrupt democracies. But we have to be very careful. The liberties that we have gained, we have to ensure that we maintain them, because you can have both sides of the process. And I'm careful about just not copying what Mr. Kagame has achieved in his country, because don't forget that Kagame has been running a country that came out of a genocide that killed over 800,000 people in 1994. So you do not take the situation of Rwanda and bring it like we need those kind of leadership with a strong man everywhere in Africa. This will appeal to military people to come back to power. This was at the, if you remember, at the origin of African independence in the 1960s, early 70s, when the militaries decided to enter into the political sphere across African countries. That's what they used to say. We need to rescue the nation. We need to bring discipline, order. But at the end of the day, they failed. And that's why during the democratization in 1989, in the wake of the changements that happened in Eastern Europe and in the tide of democratization across the world after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, that was the moment when the military were asked to return to the barrack as an exchange to allow the civilian to come and properly manage the resources and the democracy, the freedoms across the nations in Africa. That was a deal that was not unfortunately respected by the civilian who took over. They turned out to be worse than the military, but still, despite all odds, we need to maintain our efforts at democratization, because the militaries, they have their duties to protect the nation, to ensure that they can help in some engineering, civilian work across the countries, but not just come and run the countries. They need to be under the leadership of the civilians, but enlightened leadership who can put ahead the interests of the countries instead of their own interests.
You hit the nail on the head. You hit the nail on the head there, Adama, didn't you? Because, Olly, what is lacking so pervasively across the continent seems to be this kind of inspirational leadership that might give democracy a real chance. Is it the leadership that's lacking?
No, I don't think. I think the biggest mistake you can have while thinking about democracy and development is to put this all about leaders. You know, to fetishize leaders as if they're kind of messiahs that are going to come up with all the answers. Actually, what are the safeguards of democracy? Leadership is part of it, but so is active citizens. It's vigilant citizens. It's people who participate as citizens and make demands for accountability. If people are so disillusioned that they're just prepared to sell their vote, that shows what they think is rational in the situation. If people are going to make demands about what they would like to see from their leaders, then you're going to get accountable leaders. It's about how people participate. The second thing it's also about is about the institutions and the structures. So in Nigeria, for instance, there have been a lot of reports which haven't particularly progressed very far on constitutional reform, on taking all of these eggs out of the one basket of centralised powers. Another example would be the police reform bill that was just put out by the outgoing Nigerian Senate, which talks about devolving power, making the centres of power and accountability a bit closer to ordinary people, so that not everything is concentrated in Abuja, not everything is concentrated only in the hands of a president or state governance. It's also about participation. And that's kind of everyday democracy. That's much more important to how communities run, how services run, to people's expectations, than just waking up in the morning and expecting a leader to do the right thing.
Right, OK. Would you agree, Adama, then, at this particular point, as we look at 20 years of democracy in Nigeria, would you agree, as some analysts are pointing out, that there seems to be a bit of a slide away from democratic values and that the continent is moving away and losing patience, if you like, with the process and perhaps turning their sights to the strong man form of leadership and away from democracy as we would define it?
Absolutely. There is a tendency of people getting disappointed with democracy. And in the absence of the projection of the state across the countries, protecting people, providing for the basic amenities, people are saying, what is in it for us, this type of democracy? Some are yearning now for the type of Hobbesian rule where you have a Leviathan, some strong people who can come and discipline the nation, protect it against the type of forces, interlope forces, violences, extremists that are appearing across the continent, from Mali to Burkina Faso to the northern part of Nigeria like Boko Haram. People are saying we need a state that protects us. We need a state that provides for some common goods like roads, defense, sovereignty, some of those aspects. But that is not enough. I think that in order, whatever we want to achieve, we need to have capable states, because type of leaders that are violent cannot deliver the results. The type of state that you have seen in China or in Singapore or in Taiwan and others are states that are capable, led by people who are enlightened, knowledgeable.
Absolutely, Adama. But many people,
human resources.
But many people would argue that human freedoms and civil liberties are very, very restricted in those very countries that you mentioned. But Olly, coming to you now, what role is there for former colonial powers, for instance, for the great powers of the world? I mean, in the past, the Americans have had this a campaign, if you like, of encouraging democratic practices on the African continent. I think we could agree that under President Trump, there's been a lack of interest, shall we say, and everyone is pretty much left to get on with their with whatever they want to do. Do you think that this is having much of an impact and it could turn things around?
I mean, I think one of the things to say about the relationship between, the Western powers, or as you said, and Africa, is that right-wing populism is on the rise. Dissatisfaction with democracy and the liberal model is on the rise in Europe and the US just as much as it is in African countries. You could see the election of somebody like Trump as exactly the same kind of yearning for this kind of charismatic, leader who seems to have all the answers, just as it is with Putin or just as it is in many African countries. So I think that, those political events in the West demystified Western democracy a lot and made everybody realize that, public participation in democracy is subject to the same challenges and the same fickle winds all of the time. I think the one role that, the international community has had in a lot of countries where democracy has been difficult to entrench is to help keep space open for civil society, but to try and second guess what countries should be choosing as their kind of path towards institutional consolidation is not the role of the global community. It's to make sure that oppression is not rampant, and it's to make sure that democratic space is kept open for dialogue. But really the specifics of a dialogue, they're not for the rest of the world to decide, they're for a country to decide for itself.
All right. Adam, I'll give the last word to you. We've got a minute, OK? And I just want to get a sense of how optimistic you are or otherwise, having observed the transition on the continent for many countries, at least, into democracy. How optimistic are you that it will really take root and benefit the people?
I am, to a certain extent, a democracy crusader, and I believe that democracy is needed in Africa. But I'm a bit pessimistic in the sense that what democracy has allowed is new form of control of our countries by external forces. Take the case of Senegal, where somebody came overnight and took the oil and gas of Senegal, signed for him without the knowledge of the people. This is no democracy. And in other places across Africa, you have people who can control from afar our nations. We have this form of democracy that is there, but this is not true democracy, and our people are not involved in the management of their day-to-day life. Public policies are decided without them. If we want truly democracy to be entrenched in Africa, we need to be serious about it and return to the drawing board and sit down about the best practices that we must implement in words, not in words only, but in deeds, in action. And that is not the case. So democracy is a very serious proposition. What we have seen over these past 20 years,
all right.
Even more, because it's since 1989 has not been true democracy. We need to be serious about it, and Africa must play a key role in making sure that democracy becomes part of the proposition of Africa's way forward in this 21st century.
Great. We're out of time. Thank you both very much. Olly Owen, lecturer at Oxford University's Africa Studies Centre, talking to us from Edinburgh. Adama Gaye, as always, good to talk to you, talking to us live from London. And thank you, as ever, for watching the programme. If you want to see it again, you can go to our website, aljazeera.com. If you want more discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And there's the Twitter sphere, of course. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm @Martine Dennis. Thank you for watching the programme, and we'll see you again soon.